3. It was halfway through the summer holidays, a quiet day as I was looking at the Mole Studies teaching schedule when Dumbledore asked whether I needed anything for my lessons. Professor Sprout could accompany me to Diagon for supplies, he told me. I did, and I would need to visit some mole shops too, for household items, matches, dishwashing liquid, exercise books and pens, for all students wrote their work like non-magical children, newspapers, a saucepan, and other things which were foreign to wizarding students. The day we visited happened to be the day that a lot of students were there with their parents buying their own supplies. Professor Sprout, a cheerful, happy witch, told me to meet her at the Mole Wall in an hour, where she would accompany me around the wizard shops once I had been to the mole ones. There was little to get in Diagon, but, like the new children, those who had also never been before, I goggled at the marvels, the sweet shop, their wand shop, where Mum and Dad had presumably taken Ashcroft, when he had been 11, the familiar shop, where animals and plants could be bought, and the sports shop, where I, like several young children, were marveling at a racing broom that was even better than the Nimbus 2001, I heard them say. It's a firebolt. Fastest broom ever. Only professional players can handle it. One of those students happened to be Ron Weasley, who recognized me, and introduced me to his family. I told them I was to be their Mole Studies teacher next year, as Miss Burbage was working away from the school, which caught their interest, especially that of Mr. Weasley, who evidently liked all mole things, and worked in the misuse of mole artifacts office, at the ministry. "How do you come to be here?" asked Mrs. Weasley, and I told them that my parents were wizards and they'd adopted me. A look passed between Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, when I told them my name, and I guessed they knew I was not a witch, but they said nothing, and neither did I. As Ron hurried over to meet his friend, out of whose company he, and Harry Potter barely seemed to be, ushering his sister with him, Mrs. Weasley told me that I was welcome at any time to their home, the Burrow, in Dorset, not far from Miss Burbage. "You went with her a few years ago, didn't you, dear?" Mrs. Weasley asked. "Her mum told me you were like sisters," to which her husband added, "Yes, Miss Pemberton. I believe my father knew yours, a long time ago." And, in a whisper added, he never believed the scurrilous gossip, finishing with Mrs. Weasley whispering, "And he and his wife adopting you, after your poor brother ... We were at school with him ... A Hufflepuff, but brave enough to be a Gryffindor, clever enough to be a Ravenclaw, pure-blooded enough to be a Slytherin. Won every prize and award going. And he was such a good fellow, took it all modestly, with good grace, not like some might. When we heard he had been taken ill ... I could only imagine what they went through. We have 7, if anything happens to any of them." Ron interrupted just then, saying that Harry had arrived, and I said my goodbyes. After an increasingly panicked 20 minutes I eventually found Professor Sprout in a shop called The Magic Garden, obscured by plants and foliage of all kinds. How we ever managed to get my shopping and what seemed like the entire contents of the garden shop back on Professor Sprout's broom I didn't want to guess, but she asked me to pull out what seemed like a cotton shopping bag from a pocket on the inside of her robe, and to shake it out. "Put your things in, dear," Professor Sprout said. While I looked at the bag doubtfully, she made encouraging noises through the greenery. That's it. Now, carefully take with these, carefully now. The snapdragon's bite." Shopping stowed in what looked like Mum's never-ending basket, and we returned to the wizarding school, Professor Sprout veering towards the greenhouses to take out my beauties. I walked up with the bag, an uneasy feeling creeping over me as if I were being followed, which I was, only by Hagrid, who was delighted to tell me that he had been made teacher in care of magical creatures. I told him of my temporary appointment, and that I was sorry I had missed him all summer. Hagrid went on to explain that care of magical creatures meant he had to source a few from far-flung places, including a very special one, he added, tapping the side of his nose. That night, the last day of August, I put my lesson resources together to a darkening sky, having been outside on the grass by my classroom window at the time, and ran for the door, thinking it was a summer storm, and I am so glad that I did. I was then called to the start of term staff meeting, and, along with the usual start of term information, was told that Dementors would be patrolling the school grounds, which explained the darkness, trying to find an escaped murderer from Azkaban who was, more than likely, targeting Harry Potter. "Why?" I asked, next to a sneering Snape. "Why that student in particular?" "Can it be that you don't know?" asked Professor McGonagall, in awe. When I didn't reply, she looked across to Dumbledore, who then continued the dreadful story that Sirius Black, Harry's godfather, his parents' friend, had broken his secret oath to keep them hidden from Voldemort. "Just one moment," Dumbledore said, "and he told me he had arranged for Professor Sprout to take me home again, and, as it wasn't necessary for me to be at the welcome feast, I could stay until tomorrow evening. Whereupon, Pomona will collect you, and you will be ready to begin your day on Monday." I told my parents about the chamber and how a young boy, Harry Potter, had defeated the basilisk. The chamber was closed, no one had been seriously hurt, and of my appointment, just for a year, as teacher of Mole Studies. Both Mum and Dad, careworn, and much older than I remembered them from Christmas, were delighted with my job, and Dad was sorry to tell me that there was no change in their situation. After breakfast the next day, Dad went to the large garage at the bottom of the garden and gave me a present, his broom, a lightning shot, and though I couldn't fly it, it felt special. Mum then handed Dad Ashcroft's wand, which he gave to me, too. Both of them looked pleased and proud. I didn't know what to say about that. It was their son's. They knew he could never use it again. I could never use it either. But it felt important, significant, and I returned to Hogwarts feeling both elated, and altogether nervous. But Dumbledore was wrong that I would be arriving back and attending lessons immediately. Through swarms of what seemed like black jellyfish of Dementors, Professor Sprout flew us, and we were called immediately to a meeting where the nature of my being Mole brought up adopted by wizards was disclosed to the entire staff. "An ideal replacement," declared little Professor Flitwick, a comment to which Snape snorted. A new teacher, sandy brown hair and pale eyes, looked at him in mild interest, then smiled at me. I smiled back to him, whereupon he was introduced to us as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. Dumbledore explained to those few who did not already know, that he suffered from lycanthropy. I felt a jolt in my stomach, as Dumbledore told us he was bitten at a young age, and took a potion to control its severity. I looked at him. Poor man, I thought, noticing deep scars on his face and neck, and I tried not to let pity show on mine. We smiled at one another briefly as the meeting ended, but I was too caught up in making sure I was fully prepared for teaching the next day to talk to Remus Lupin. Whereas my first day went well, with most lessons containing a Weasley who had smiled and said hello, Hagrid's had not. I went after my lessons were over to find him, and he told me, with some distress, that his hippogriff, which he had thought to be the star of his lessons, had attacked a boy, Draco Malfoy. We got him to the hospital wing, Hagrid babbled, offering me tea with shaking hands, but I can't use him now, and the matter has been reported to the ministry. One question, I asked, to a thoroughly miserable Hagrid, and I asked what a hippogriff was. Hagrid was only too pleased to show me, but told me to keep safely back. My second day, the children learning about telephones, and comparing them to fluing was also good, and began with my first need to ask for the soundproofing spell from the teacher next door. Professor Lupin did it promptly, asking me what my day was going to be like, and telling me that his promised to be interesting. First year's learning defensive spells, 5th year's learning reflecting charms, 2nd year's and dark magic creatures. I told him what my students would be learning about, writing letters, stamps and postboxes, and comparing this communication method to owl post. He smiled, and our days continued like that. My request for soundproofing, his short chat on our prospective days. I was soon at ease with teaching and happy, although the days were long and tiring. One student began to worry me. As the weeks went on, Hermione Granger was looking paler and more tired in every lesson. I went to her head of house, but Professor McGonagall told me there was nothing to worry about. Hermione worked far harder than any other student, and she was bound to ask a lot of questions, which she had done. I was pleased to be able to draw the players. Once the Quidditch began, although it was uncomfortable trying to watch the game with Dementors lurking on the perimeter, though delighted to have a team to support, Hufflepuff. The term had begun well, and had been uneventful. Until the night that Sirius Black tried to break in. It was a Friday night. I had come up late from the Mole Studies classroom and, too late for tea, I went to the staff room to see if there was any fruit. Often there was some all day, and hot tea, plus comfortable chairs to sit on, though I knew that if you sat on the most comfortable ones you might not be able to get back out again because they got hungry. The corridors were unusually quiet for the start of a weekend and, as I approached the staff quarters, a rush of air came down, knocking me against the wall. I could just make out some eerie sounds and deduced that it was the castle ghosts, upset by something. Reaching for the knob of my door, I twisted again, but the door would not open. Damn Filch. It's term time. Has he decided to lock me out at weekends as well, now? Let's see if Professor Sprout could help me, I thought, as I marched back up the corridor, but to my horror I found that I was unable to get through. It was as if an invisible barrier was preventing me going any further, no matter how hard I pushed or tried to step past. It took nearly 2 hours before anyone came to find me, by which time a knot of anxiety was tightening in my stomach. The light from 2 wands approached, and appeared to have no problem with the corridor that had stopped me. I wiped my face with my hands, hoping my distress wasn't evident as Professors Lupin and, a little further behind Snape, neared. "Miss Pemberton, we have found you at last!" exclaimed Professor Lupin warmly, turning a little to Snape, to whom he gave a wide smile. I got to my feet, a swell of relief washing over me that someone had discovered I was missing. "Ah, you have found her then," snarled Snape, shouldering Professor Lupin out of the way, glaring at me and holding his wand close to my face. I blinked and tried to shield my eyes. "So, you were not outside the castle grounds after all?" "I was not outside the castle grounds," I repeated, in frustration. "Why would I be there? I was unable to get into my room. Then I was unable to find any children or staff. I couldn't even get back up the corridor," I added, looking past them both and into the darkness. "But, perhaps you did find one person, one you were planning to meet?" I frowned, an expression that was met with derision. "Oh, you're good," sneered Snape, bending over me. "Very good. You may have Dumbledore fooled, but I am not so easily deceived." He turned on his heel, swishing away. What a hateful man, I thought, staring after him. Professor Lupin stepped into his place, and smiled again. "I can open your door," said Professor Lupin, raising his wand and flicking his wrist. Elahomera. At once, the knob turned under magic and folded back on its hinges. As for the children and staff, the school is in lockdown. Sirius Black entered the school tonight searching for Harry Potter. My mind flooded with Dumbledore's words, of Harry's parents' betrayal by Sirius Black. Poor child, to have to deal with so much. Lupin stepped past me and flicked his wand again towards the candles in the fireplace, each then glowing orange. "Harry is all right?" I asked. "Indeed." I remember Remus looking around my room, checking every corner, and then looking back to me. "Anything else I can help you with?" I shook my head and, once he had gone, I listened to the sound of Lupin's feet grow quieter as I sat with my back to the door. The following Monday, after a weekend of murmured retelling of Sirius Black's break-in, from both staff and students alike, I had finished preparing a lesson on Mole literature planned for that day. Opening the door to the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, I was horrified to find it was Snape in place of Professor Lupin, putting on each desk a copy of the third-year textbook. My heart sank, my words with it as he looked at me coldly. "Yes?" "I was expecting Professor Lupin. Clearly you can see he is not here." "Then, if you are teaching in here, would you be so kind as to perform the wall silencing spell?" Without a word he did so, and over the next few days when I came each morning to ask for the same thing, he barely acknowledged me, but did as I asked. I refused to give in to the urge to ask him where Professor Lupin was, but, on the 5th day I did. "Ill," Snape sneered, as my mind scrolled through possibilities. incapacitated for the present moment. And that night, as I sat up by the light of the full moon, adding to my latest picture of the Ravenclaw Seeker from their last winning match, I saw for myself the reason. A dishevelled, bedraggled Remus Lupin was staggering back through the balding forest, holding his side, as if injured. But he had disappeared again as I was deciding to do something for him. Hagrid had some distressing news. I came to see him at the start of winter, bitter, biting winds which swept snow flurries around the castle grounds to find out the possibility of taking the students out for a lesson in the near forest, but that was forgotten when I encountered a very low gamekeeper who told me that the ministry hearing had condemned the hippogriff. Consoling him, I wondered what could be done. An appeal? To whom? Hagrid sniffed, using the tablecloth to wipe his nose. The ruling was signed by Minister Fudge himself. I was trying to keep busy in the run-up to Christmas, lessons were busy and I spent my free time drawing and painting. The busier I was, the faster time would pass and the sooner, with luck, Albus Dumbledore would tell me that I could go to see my parents again. It was the last match of the term, a cold, rain-lashed evening, throwing its wrath down onto the Hufflepuff and Gryffindor teams. Hufflepuff were just ahead, their seeker having just flashed by the staff seating, figure of 8ing around the nearer two of Gryffindor's goals. I could not draw in that weather, so I tried to watch as closely as I could, to remember all I could. The sky darkened so quickly that I could hardly see any of the players. The whistle went, and I could understand why. Through the gloom, in the darkness, black, humanoid shapes filled the stadium, and Harry Potter fell from his broom. From behind me, a sudden burst of light poured out, illuminating the darkness, repelling the Dementors from the vicinity. From its light I could see that the students and staff were hurrying back towards the school, the staff rounding up students at each of the 4 exit points of the Quidditch towers. Another burst of light. This time, its projection finished with the outline of an animal, a wolf. I got up, grasping the handrail as I went, for the steps were slippery, the rain lashing in from the open sides. I could just let go. I felt myself thinking. No one would notice. What use am I to anyone? Whoever heard of a mole in a wizard's school? Getting to the bottom, I felt my legs go from under me. These are really rather good. I sat up, blinked a few times, wondering where I was. My room, my bed. I looked over towards the curved window. A person was sitting at my desk. You fainted, you were soaking wet. I looked down at myself, and the bed. Both were completely dry. An evaporation charm. Couldn't put you to bed damp, you would have got a cold. Remus Lupin got to his feet, a picture of mine in his hand. Thank you, I managed, pulling myself up. Then, making my way over to him, I tottered a little. Lupin caught my arm and steered me to the edge of my bed, sitting down next to me. Lupin, who told him to call him Remus, please, asked how I was. Now the Dementors have gone, I don't feel so awful. But Harry Potter. He had fallen in the match, I said. That was 4 hours ago, Remus replied, smiling. He has had chocolate, the best remedy there is if there are Dementors in the vicinity. He leaned over towards me, a small square of honeydukes in his hand. Are you in need? That is most kind, I said, taking it and then eating the chocolate, its smooth creaminess filling my mouth, its soothing effect beginning almost immediately. Thank you, Professor Lupin, I said, to which he reiterated I should use his first name. Helianthus, I nodded, the full effects of the chocolate taking hold, and smiled. A lovely name. Sunflowers? Not many people know that, I replied. Why do you work here? Remus asked. If you are a mole? I have no mole family, I explained. My adopted parents are magical. My brother is on the picture downstairs, outside the Great Hall. He really was a wizard. I pay for his care with my work here. I stopped, feeling I had overshared. I got up, expecting him to go, but he didn't. Instead, he sat admiring my last sketch of Ernie Macmillan and we carried on talking into the night, Remus telling me he never remembered a time had not been a werewolf and that he had never really made friends until Hogwarts, And us four, the times we had. And my mind drifted to when I had seen him, unkempt and injured, at the time of the full moon, and, when he turned, there was a recent wound on side of neck. It's no wonder he was not in a fit state to teach lessons sometimes. He told me about Harry and you-know-who. I listened in wonder. I had never been told that before. You must have lived a sheltered life with your parents then. That boy is famous throughout the wizard world. Everyone knows his name. Why? Because he defeated you-know-who, prevented him from continuing. His spell backfired and Harry was not killed. This reduced you-know-who to a mere shadow. But, Remus continued, Harry's life has never been in as much danger as right at this moment. Sirius Black. The prisoner. Remus nodded. He has managed to overcome Azkaban. He's looking for Harry. It grieves me. He was our friend, looked after me on transformation nights. Sounds like you have had a terrible life, I replied. Not as much as if Dumbledore had not given me chances. The first was to attend Hogwarts at all. The second, to work here. I nodded. A lot of people owe Dumbledore, I said. And then Darklyn chose that moment to jump in through the window, coiling her black body around my legs, which she stopped after one look at Remus, yowled and ran. I have that effect on a lot of animals, he said sadly. A lot of humans too. Not me, I thought. You are a very interesting man, and I said so. We talked about the castle, the ghosts, the feasts, the Quidditch, how James, Harry's father, had been top seeker at school. I listened, laughed, felt my spirits come alive again, like buds after winter. Hogsmeade? Remus asked, as a thin red line traced along the horizon. We had not been to bed. It was dawn. Luckily it was Saturday and I was not due to supervise prep until that evening. I've never been, I replied, stifling a yawn. Professor Burbage used to do the things I needed with magic, but she's obviously not here this year. How would it be if I escorted you? The children are due to go down next weekend. I agreed. He seemed a very nice man, funny, thoughtful. Hogsmeade in his company sounded like a very nice thing indeed. I held the door open as he went. Good to meet you, Professor Pemberton, said Remus Lupin, holding out his hand. I took it, and shook it. You too, Professor Lupin. As I was thinking about what a remarkable night that had been, I was almost certain I saw another figure sweeping along the corridor, snorting in the direction of my door. I flew, speaking to Mum and Dad again, hoping for Christmas again with them. It had been over 2 years since their original arrest and I had been investigating the law over such matters. By now, the ministry needed to charge people under arrest or let them go. How are things going? Asked Mum. We understand that there is an escaped murderer on the loose, and dementors everywhere. Yes, I'm well, I assured her. Teaching is good, though tiring. A lot of the students know more than me. Use that to your advantage, Dad advised. But there was no mention of my return to them, not even by Dumbledore, who closed the file link with no further comment. December came and, when I went to ask about soundproofing, Remus reminded me of my agreement to accompany him to Hogsmeade the next day. We walked, with the rest of the staff, the mile to the village, talking about our day, and the last Quidditch match of the season, Slytherin and Gryffindor, which, if they won, would put Slytherin ahead going into Christmas. The Hog's Head, a dark, cobwebby pub, was where we intended to stay for just an hour, but spent most of the day talking, school, and how A-levels had been more about my social life than actual studying, and if I could go back and change that, I would. Remus frowned at my paying the bill, which was hardly expensive, for we had spent more time talking than drinking, and I told him it was a debt that needed paying. I appreciate what you did for me at Halloween, I added, Remus holding the door open for me as we stepped out into the icy street. He turned, and with a smile said, "What are friends for?" Christmas holidays couldn't come fast enough, and I waited until I could wait no more for Dumbledore to tell me whether I could visit home. The children always left early on the last day of term, and, once they had gone, I climbed almost to the top of the head teacher's tower, at which the griffin moved aside and the door opened. I knew better than to wonder how Dumbledore knew, and he explained that I would be unable to visit them. Security had been tightened and I felt very disappointed. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day and I was dreading no food, restricted access to my classroom, outside, even my room. And I made my way to the Great Hall. Sitting at the end of the staff table, I wondered what to do next. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Remus Lupin. "I'd be delighted if you would join me for lunch," he said, and asked me what was wrong. When he saw my face, "I am reduced to nothing at holiday time," I began. "Filch makes sure the spell for my room is taken away, and of course the house elves don't acknowledge me as I am not," I lowered my voice, "magical. And I am unable to go home this year." Remus looked at me for a moment, just as a house elf, ignoring me, brought in a huge steaming bowl of food, and shot up. "Wait here," he said, "enjoy this delicious stew." And he returned half an hour later, as the house elf came looking for his bowl, asking for more. "All sorted?" "Really?" I asked, cynically. "No more randomly sleeping on chairs in the staff room when I can't find a witch or wizard to open my door? No more taking food from the Great Hall at times when you all are being served for times when I can't?" "Thank you," I said, "for whatever you did." I put my hand on top of his, feeling a surge of gratitude as strong as when Dumbledore had asked me to work here, saving me from my memory being taken and my family lost to me. We walked back along the corridor, stopping by my brother's picture. I showed him the names of the young wizards in the picture, including that of Ashcroft Pemberton, scrolled across the bottom of the frame. "Did you know him?" I asked. Remus shook his head. "No, he's older than me. Looking at these dates, I began here in 1969. He turned to look at me. "How is your day looking?" "Rather empty," I said, truthfully. "I cannot go to see my parents as they are under high security house arrest, nor Ashcroft, as it takes magic to access his ward at St. Mungo's." Silence reigned, and then Remus asked, "Could I be permitted to escort you? It would be no trouble." "I couldn't possibly," I began, but then saw he was serious. "But how to get there?" he mused. Then a thought occurred to me. "Can you fly a broom? It's old." We walked down to the broom store, an outhouse in the foundations of the castle. At one side, the students who played Quidditch stored their brooms by team position, 4 areas reserved for each of the 4 schoolhouses. Next, arranged across the broad wall at the back, student brooms were tethered to the wall according to their year, the Newt students occupying one part of the right wall, with the staff brooms next to them. On the wall through whose door they had come were the Quidditch lesson brooms, a random assortment of old brooms, basic brooms like Clent sweeps. On the corner, between the Newt brooms and the Clent sweeps were the staff brooms. From behind several of them I eased out Ashcroft's broom, handing it questioningly to Remus, hoping it was all right. I understood as he broke into a beaming smile. "It's magnificent!" Remus exclaimed, running his hand carefully along the shaft. He looked at me, his face alive. "You know about Mulcars, Helianthus?" I nodded. "This is." He looked up and down it again, impressed, "the E-type jaguar of broomsticks." Remus smoothed his fingers over the polished handle, his fingers pressing the embossed lettering of Lightning Shot, then over its sleek bristles. So few were made, such superior quality. I never understood the significance. Not then, not now. I had flown so many times with Dad and he had never discussed broom types with me. To me it was just Dad and Mum's broom. "Come on," he said, taking my hand, hurrying out of the broom store. To St. Mungo's. Over snowy landscape, hedges like tiny dark matchsticks sticking up and snow-covered houses we flew. Once or twice I closed my eyes as we swooped past trees whose branches were laden with snow heaps. I leaned back towards Remus as we soared higher to make the most of the thermals, not prepared enough for the cold, and he held on to me tightly around the waist, his long, warm arm secure around me. When we got there, Remus made the most of the ground floor seating area, waiting outside as I climbed the stairs to the 6th floor, not mapped as it was not supported by the ministry. Ashcroft was well. He seemed to be talking to his healers, his head moving backwards and forwards, and saw me, but as usual did not acknowledge or talk to me. I waited and watched, and the healer who had spoken to me last year told me he had been doing well, and did I give permission for therapy that would ease his symptoms? I wanted to speak to Mum, but that was impossible, so I thought what my parents would have wanted, and that would anything for Ashcroft. I agreed to for more of my wages to be deducted for this. "You look happier," said Remus, as he held me tight next to him, though I spent most of the flight back to Hogwarts wondering if I had made the right choice. Mum and Dad were his next of kin, not me. Remus's voice woke me out of my thoughts when we neared Hogwarts, as he pointed out a herd of unicorns in a clearing in the Forbidden Forest, their horse-shaped bodies glittering against the snow. "Come on," Remus said, after taking the lightning shot down, taking my hand, and we walked closer to them. They were even more beautiful than from the air, their bodies iridescent, and, when they moved, they left behind a shimmering vapor. Because I was shivering, Remus pulled me closer, wrapping his cloak about me, and we stood there for what seemed like an age, the ethereal glow from the unicorns the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I leaned towards him and felt, first a hand holding mine, then an arm around my shoulders. During that day, something changed between us, from Hogsmeade when we were colleagues, friends. After visiting my brother, something more. We came down several more times that holiday on the lightning shot, but never found the unicorns again. One day, when we were walking together under the East Tunnel, which led to Hogsmeade, Remus told me about the circumstance in which the Potters, opposing the Death Eaters and Voldemort, died, and what had happened to him since. The sky was dark with Dementors, so we sat under an overhanging rock, the wind scuttling round us, but part of the rock sheltered us from it, and Remus put an impervious charm around us, so we could sit there, undisturbed. His exile felt like, to me, my worst times at Hogwarts, isolated, friendless, alone. But here was a better place to be exiled than in a lonely cottage in the Lake District, where he had been, and I was horrified to hear about it. Remus told me about Sirius, who had always remembered him after their time at school and had visited him to keep him in line when he transformed. His three friends, Sirius, James and Peter, had become animagi to keep him company, which was why Sirius was reported as being a black dog, because he could transform into one at will. We would go out to that tree, the Humping Willow, on moon nights. "It has a name?" I asked, horrified, because it was that tree I had had to avoid all of the previous year when I gave my best effort in refurbishing the Ford Anglia. "It leads to the Shrieking Shack, the most haunted house in Britain, whose shrieks and moans could disguise my howling." "People could never honestly believe what he was imprisoned for," said Remus, sadly. "He was so honest, so loyal to James and I." We sat there, looking at the snowscape, and then I turned and kissed him, just lightly, on the lips, breaking off for a moment. And then Remus kissed me back, pulling me closer, wrapping me up in his cloak. We sat like that for a long time, watching the sky spit snowflakes about. And, after waking up in his arms the next morning, I knew. With a kiss I left, looming work preparation shifting in the eaves of my mind, with a reward of meeting that evening in the Great Hall for dinner, my necessity. I turned the corner into my part of the corridor. And then edged back. Snape's voice reverberated in the background, its slow growl unmistakable. "Lupin, is it not your time?" "Not that it is any concern of yours, Severus. There is propriety to consider. Like you and Miss Burbage." I was about to close the door to my room when I heard Snape say, "And she chose to stay all night in your quarters? I do not know who I feel more sorry for." Again. Remus's voice remained calm. "None of this is your concern. I'm warning you, Lupin. You and her." "Warning me of what, Severus?" I heard Remus give a light laugh and Snape a throaty kind of growl and then fading footsteps. It was a long time before I understood the significance of Severus Snape's concern. January and February faded together, dark, and cold, and Dementor-filled. 2 episodes that Remus had had to deal with. I watched from my window on both occasions to see if I could see him. Though, what would I do if I did? At Christmas, With the castle virtually to ourselves, our relationship was intimate, intense, but now, with term well underway, with the teaching of and caring for the students, with the Dementors still haunting the school and the threat of black, our professional relationship was clipped and formal. We had weekends, when we were not supervising prep or duty, and our limited time together was exhilarating, and just our own. We would fly the lightning shot. Remus would take me to Hogsmeade, to the Hog's Head. What I remember of those times, just as, together, his arm round me, us laughing at things that had happened in lessons, at staff, at the walk or flyther. Just as, together. I went to see Hagrid, as the sentence for Buckby loomed, and, as I crossed the iron-hard grounds, I spotted a strange thing, a dog, shaggy, black, bounding over the rocks. It was Remus's time, and for the first time he had been attacked, and severely at that. I could only deduce who had attacked him. The only teacher I could find to help him, panting, covered in sweat, body and leg torn through his clothes, the only teacher whose door glowed, suggesting occupation, was Snape. Reluctantly, I banged on his door. Met with a snarl, I explained how I had found him and that he needed help. For a moment, I thought that he was going to slam the door in my face, but instead, he strode past me without a word, and attended him, barking at me to fetch Dumbledore. Between the two of them, Remus Lupin was conveyed to Madame Pomfrey. In your own time. I am sure he would appreciate your care, was all Dumbledore had to say to me, while Snape took a step towards me, as if to say something, but instead walked past me. I had to endure another month of asking for the Silencio spell on the wall from a mute, bad-tempered defense against the dark arts temporary teacher with barely concealed hatred of me. And all the time I spent with Remus, soothing him as he recovered, I wondered, did he chance upon Black? Or did he go out looking for him? Remus became better, and, though I came to see him less, the question of his motives of that night was never far from my mind. We talked about school and lessons, but the conversations became increasingly staid as he did not confide in me anything of that evening either. I date our drifting apart from the night of his attack. I had even less reason to go to the defense classroom now, for, on learning that Snape was teaching again, I began to send a student to request the silencing spell on the wall. One day Alicia Spinnet came back to tell me that, Professor Snape told me to tell you, Professor Pemberton, that he has made the spell permanent. A week after Remus's attack, Dumbledore called me to his office to tell me that my parents were being moved to a high-security prison within the Ministry. One step away from Azkaban, he told me that night. So, while Remus recovered, I spent a good deal of my time in the library in the magical law section, trying, with my limited knowledge of both legal matters and knowing little of my parents' history, to come up with some answers. So, with both the silencing spell in place and my preoccupation with my parents, I was unaware when Remus returned to teaching. I made the effort to visit him in his quarters several times, but my insistent tapping was never answered, like the worst knock-knock joke in history. It was when Professor McGonagall intervened to ask me if I was well that I broke down and sobbed in her office. My parents, I explained, I am so worried about them. But she advised me not to go out of the castle while the Dementors were around, and assigned me a teaching assistant, and of all people it was to be Argus Filch. A day later, Professor Sprout offered to fly me to St. Mungo's. I offered her the lightning shot, which she admired greatly as a classic broomstick. I was glad to get there when I did. Ashcroft was sickening. "Is this the new treatment?" I asked, but the healer said that his disease took people that way, and unfortunately the new treatment was not working for him. Drawing was my one consolation, and it was the fourth full moon after Christmas, after a particularly trying day with Mr. Filch being as unhelpful as he could, when I spotted from my window a figure making his way down the grassy bank, past Hagrid's hut and towards the Forbidden Forest. Guessing who that would be, and feeling a wash of sadness come over me, I looked away, continuing to capture the row of treetops on paper, when I saw something else, a black dog following him. Darklan followed me into the Forbidden Forest as I found Remus, not far from our cave, breathing heavily, torn sleeve and blood in his hair. This time, instead of avoiding me, Remus allowed me to help, and I nursed him that night and made him comfortable. He held my hand, and the mistake I must have made in asking him about Sirius Black, but it was clear he had met with him again that night. "I was in the forest tonight," Remus told me, his voice weak and his speech broken. "I met with Sirius Black, tried to talk to him." "And he did this to you?" "I have since come across new information, reliable information, that means it may not him. He may not be the Potter's murderer, Helianthus," Remus said, ignoring my question. "Then tell someone, Dumbledore. I need evidence. I want to kiss him again, like we did so many times at Christmas." Took his hand, poor, damaged hand instead, which curled around mine as he slept. Remus was better than last time, and quickly returned to lessons. He visited me on his first day back and, as I was painting, charmed my brush into painting the scene I was composing, so the features of the landscape moved quickly like old zoetrope. One night when Remus was on duty, I used my time to work in the library to see what I could find out to aid my parents. Very little, as it turned out. Disappointed, and resolved to speak to someone, a wizard solicitor, for example, I noticed a child out of bed. Harry Potter, for that's who he was also seen by another teacher, and, although I could not hear what Snape was saying, he was clearly giving the boy a severe admonishment over something he was holding. Snape was abruptly interrupted by Remus, who took the parchment. I turned to go, and caught the words, as he spoke to Remus. "I don't think the map is always right. It shows someone I thought to be dead." However, I was mistaken that I would just return from the library unencumbered, for Snape followed me, accusing me of helping Sirius Black break into the castle. I stopped, angry now, from my failure in the library and this wizard's huge grudge against me for some reason. "Why me?" I demanded. "Because." He poked his wand into my shoulder, then into my neck. "He is an escaped prisoner looking for more Death Eater followers of the Dark Lord." "And you think I am a Death Eater?" "Isn't." I broke off, biting away the name my parents knew that wizard to be, biting away the name Tom. "Isn't he who must not be named trying to murder muggles? I am a muggle. Why would I be working for someone who wants to murder me?" "You tell me," snarled Snape, nastily. "Maybe ... you are working for someone." "Like who?" "Like your father, for instance. The great Edmund Pemberton got so close to Grindelwald, then cowardice overcame him. Used his ministry influence to get him out of Azkaban. Collecting a pension given by an embarrassed ministry." I gaped at him. "No," I protested. "My father was." I broke off. "Yes?" demanded Snape, pressing his wand into my neck. "It wasn't for me to defend my family, but I did it anyway. My father did his job in the downfall of Grindelwald superbly. More than superbly, if some people believe he was a traitor. Can you not conceive the notion of a double agent?" Snape did not reply. His face merely paled, to a sickening ashen hue. He opened his mouth to say something, but Remus Lupin ran past. Snape dropped his wand away and hurried after Remus, who ahead of him, had 3 figures. And another. Sirius Black. Snape roared off after them. A few seconds later, so did I. Whether or not all of those teachers were out of the school with a mind to the children or not, I knew I had to do something to safeguard them. I could not see where they had gone, and waited a safe distance from the humping willow for some time. I was only aware of Darklyn having accompanied me when, through the thick, gnarled roots of the willow, she came out in hot pursuit of a rat, which then disappeared over the ground. A great mouser was Darklyn, so undoubtedly there would be a little rat corpse before too long. I had barely a chance to think of that, though, when through the willow roots emerged Remus, with the 3 children in tow. And Sirius Black. Before I could think of anything to do about the prisoner, however, a cloud, which had partially obscured the moon, drifted past, exposing it fully, and Remus began to change. I was about to approach the children, to do something for their protection, when Snape stepped in front of Harry, Ron, and Hermione, shielding them from the werewolf. I took a step forward and Snape held his wand out towards me for a split second. However, I was knocked over as a black dog jumped towards the werewolf, towards Remus, and I felt my head make contact with the floor. "You had us all very worried, Miss Pemberton," Dumbledore told me, when I finally regained consciousness in the hospital wing. You sought to protect the children, as was your duty as a teacher, but you went above and beyond that. And he went on to tell me about Peter Pettigrew being the traitor and, as an animagus, my cat gave an admirable pursuit, but he had got away. How Sirius was indeed innocent, and how Buckbeak had been saved in the nick of time. However, I must ask you to relinquish your pictures. These could be seized by the Ministry and taken as evidence, and could be especially bad for your parents if you were known to have images of who the Ministry still believes is an escaped Death Eater. They must be destroyed? Yes, they were remarkable. One picture had Harry, Hermione and Ron running down to Hagrid's hut, another with Buckbeak chained outside. And yet another picture had Harry, Ron and Hermione having entered Hagrid's hut, and at the same time Harry and Hermione also hiding at the edge of the woods. I duly handed them over, sad that the spell would be gone too. But there was more. My parents' trial had been set for 24th August, though I did not know what they were accused of, and Dumbledore regretted that I would not be able to see them, nor speak to them. They believe, someone believes, I am helping them in the service of he who must not be named, I replied, thinking bitterly of what Snape said to me. Indeed. Also, Miss Burbage will be back in September. You have done an admirable job, Miss Pemberton, he repeated, as Mole Studies teacher. You need to retain a low profile. The castle is to be closed in order for the Ministry to rid us of Dementors. I have been asked by Remus Lupin if you would like to spend the summer with him. I was amazed, as the last time I had seen him he was transformed into a werewolf. Is he? Well, yes. If you were to accept, I think that the arrangement would be acceptable for your safety. His cottage is remote, you are aware of his condition. Professor Snape has enough of his potion for 6 months. Thank you, I said. I have enjoyed teaching, Professor. I will look forward to assisting again next year. But I did not give my answer about holidaying with Remus until he asked me himself. You can paint, you can draw. You can walk. I can fly you to your brother. I agreed, for I knew my feelings for him, strong indeed. And his for me? He began, but I put my finger to my lips and shook my head. Never fall in love in a war, I said, quoting my mum, who did it anyway. It had haunted their lives. But Remus took my hand and then leaned over to my lips, melting my words away. That summer, my living with Remus Lupin was overshadowed by my parents being charged with the historical war crime of being greater good wizards and followers of Gellert Grindelwald.